This is our next psychopathology lesson. We're going to look at depression, the characteristics of depression, and the cognitive explanation for depression. This is on paper 1, along with memory, social, and attachment. So to start off, our characteristics of depression. We need to look at cognitive, behavioural, and emotional characteristics. So the cognitive characteristics of depression are negative thoughts, such as negative self-beliefs, a sense of guilt, and worthlessness. Behavioural characteristics: reduced activity level and a sense of tiredness, a change in sleep patterns and eating behaviour. This could be an increase or decrease in sleep and an increase or decrease in eating behaviour. Then we have emotional characteristics. These are sadness, feeling empty, a feeling of worthlessness, low self-esteem, and a loss of interest. A loss of interest in general is the idea that you would find activities that you normally enjoy less interesting and you wouldn't partake in them anymore. So say you go to the gym all of the time, or you enjoy running. If you were suffering from depression, you may lose interest in these activities and not take part in them anymore. Okay, so make sure you know the cognitive, behavioural and emotional characteristics for depression. You don't need to know all of the characteristics within those, just a couple for each should be fine. You can get short mark questions, multiple choice, or questions with an item on this topic, and I'll give you some of those questions in a future lesson. So now we've looked at the characteristics, we're going to look at the explanation for depression. The explanation for depression focuses on the cognitive approach. So the explanation for phobias looked at the behaviourist approach, and now we're looking at the cognitive approach with regards to depression. So I've got a little activity here. So what I want you to do is see what you can recall about the cognitive approach, list as many keywords as you can, and define and explain as many of these as you can. I'd like you to start off by not using your notes and try and write down as much as possible, then go back through your notes and check your answers. Okay, so some key words that you might have that are related to today's lesson are theoretical models and schemas. So if you don't have these words and you're not sure what these words mean, now is the time to just do a little recap, go over what a theoretical model is, have a look at what a schema is, because that's what we're going to be talking about in today's lesson. We're going to be using examples of those. So the cognitive approach would suggest that someone with depression has faulty thinking. It focuses on the way that we think and process information. So the cognitive approach suggests that someone who's suffering from depression thinks about things a little bit differently, and they process information in a different way, and often this way is more negative than other individuals, or it might be a little bit irrational compared to other individuals. An example that I have here: someone with depression might think, if I fail my exam, it must mean I am stupid and I will never succeed. So within this explanation, we have two theoretical models. We have the ABC model and the negative triad. We'll start with the ABC model. So the ABC model was developed by an individual called Ellis, and it suggests that there's three parts that can trigger someone with depression. So we have an activating event, then we have a belief, and this is often negative and irrational with someone who's suffering from depression, and then this leads to a consequence, and if someone's suffering from depression, this consequence will be an unhealthy consequence. So if you just wanted to take some notes, and I'll give you an example. Okay, so an example of this, if we stick to what I mentioned previously about failing an exam as our example, so your activating event would be failing the exam or getting below your target grade in an exam. Some people, if they had a positive belief, they would think, oh, it's okay, I just need to work on this, this and this, and then I'll do fine next time. But if someone's suffering from depression, according to the cognitive explanation, they would have a negative thought, or a negative belief. So their belief would be, I can't do this, I'm stupid, there's just no point. And then the consequence to that would be an unhealthy emotion, such as a sense of worthlessness. And that can therefore trigger other things as well. So you might stop going to that lesson. You might stop spending time with your friends. Okay, so our example, activate an event, fill in an exam. Belief, I can't do this, I'm stupid. Consequence, feeling of worthlessness, or low self-esteem. So now I've got an application activity. One of them is the exam example, so you can write that down. And then we've got another one, so someone who's just been fired from their job as an activating event. So have a little think, what would the ABC be, especially for that first one? And can you recall what the ABC was for the example that I just gave? So for the example of someone who's just been fired, you could say, obviously activate an event is them being fired for or losing their job. The belief could be, I can't do this, I am useless, I can't provide for my family, I will never get another job, any of those examples. And then the consequence could be, again, a feeling of worthlessness or even a sense of guilt, or feeling that you're not good enough and you can't provide for your family. So that could lead to other consequences that are not just emotional consequences. It could lead to you sort of like losing hope and staying in and not going out and doing activities that you have a general interest in, because you just have this like weight on your shoulders and you just feel absolutely worthless. So you might have something similar to that. If you're unsure if that what you've got is correct, then just show me what you've written and then I can go through that and check it for you. So what you need to remember about the ABC model is that we have an activating event, we have a belief. If someone's suffering from depression, this is irrational or negative, and then we have a consequence, and this is unhealthy, negative emotions, such as those emotional characteristics that we discussed at the start. Next we have Beck's negative triad. Okay, so this links to the idea of a negative schema. So a schema is like a script that we have in our head, and it helps us understand how to behave and helps us interpret other individuals. So Beck believed that if someone was suffering from depression, it was likely that they had a negative schema and that they picked up this negative schema during childhood. This could be caused by a number of things, so it could be caused by parental rejection, peer rejection, criticisms by teachers. So I know that sometimes you feel like you're always told that you can't do something throughout school, and that can manifest itself. And then when you get to college or university, you already have a negative schema and you already have a negative perception of education in general and of yourself. You don't have the belief in yourself that you can do something. So these negative schemas are activated whenever you encounter a new situation. So this could be an exam, because this is similar to the situation in which you develop the schema. So if you've struggled throughout education and struggled with your exams, when you get to college you might take your first exam and it might be a very daunting experience for you, and then you might just have negative assumptions from the off. So it might be like, I don't even know why I'm sat here, I'm not going to do very well, I always fail in exams, I can't do exams, etc. So he tried and he developed a triad to explain how these work. So that's just a general idea. So we have a negative schema, but he explained how the schemas interact in a particular way, and this is a triad, and it's called a triad because it's kind of like a triangle. It has 3 different points. So the 3 points are here. We have a negative view of the self, a negative view of the world, and a negative view of the future. They can come in any order and they all link together. So we have some examples of thoughts that an individual might have. So A negative view of the self, I am incompetent and undeserving. A negative view of the future, problems will not disappear, there will always be emotional pain. And a negative view of the world, it is a hostile place. So for example, if we go back to the idea of someone who's failed an exam, so someone who is sitting an exam, their negative view of the self might be, I can't do this, I'm useless, I'm just no good at psychology. That would be their negative view of the self. Then their negative view of the future would be, I'm never going to pass this course, I'll never get my target grade, I'll never get into university, what's the point? I'm always going to feel worthless. And then the negative view of the world, everyone's against me, the world is a horrible place, there's no point in me trying to pass this exam anyway because everything is just awful out there. Okay, so you can see how these thoughts, you move from one to the other, and it's not just, it doesn't go in a particular order, and it can be in response to any situation. I just use the exam as an example, but you could also use other examples, and I've got an exam question in a couple of minutes time for you to have a little look at with regards to that. Okay, so for Beck's negative triad, you need to remember that there's a negative view of the self, the world, the future, and an individual has a negative schema that links into the triad, and they pick this negative schema up through childhood. So now we've got a practice question, and it's an application question. So I'd like you to have a read of this. So we've got an example here. Molly left school after her GCSEs, and then she hasn't got a job, she feels like she's unemployable, she overhears her parents arguing, she thinks that it's all her fault, she sees that her friends have moved on, and she wishes she could disappear forever. So what I'd like you to do is use either the ABC model or the negative triad and negative schemas to explain how Molly is feeling, and try and pull out as much detail from the item as possible to support your points. Okay, so I can have a look through your notes and see what answers you've got and check those for you. But an example might be with the ABC model. The activating event is that she doesn't have a job, or she fails at a job interview. The belief is that she's unemployable, and then the consequence is that she feels hopeless or worthless. That she feels like she can't help and she can't contribute. For Beck's model, you might say the negative view of the self is that she's unemployable, that she can't contribute. Negative view of the future, that she has no future. A negative view of the world is everyone else is moving on, and she's still left there behind. So the world is a cruel place. Everyone else has got a job, but everyone else has gone to university, they've all moved on and she can't. Okay? So like I said, I can check that for you in your notes. So we've got some evaluation points here. We'll start off with a little bit of research support. So we've got 2 studies here. The first study found that depressed patients made more errors in logic when they were asked to interpret written material. So basically what they would do is they would give some statements to individuals who were suffering from depression, and they would ask them to interpret what was happening. So kind of like we've just done with Molly, and when they interpret it in a negative way. And then our second study, this is a little bit similar. They were given negative automatic thought statements. So these are statements that you give to someone to make them feel depressed, and I know it's really awful, but they found that if you give these statements to individuals, they actually become more depressed. So they interpret these in a more negative way, and this makes them feel even worse. So we've got some research that suggests that there is a link there between depression and cognition. and the way that we think. You'll see at the bottom we've got a box that says, however, this research is correlational, so we cannot establish blah blah blah. So what I'd like you to do is try and fill in the gaps. So pause it and fill those gaps in. Okay, so in the gaps you should have, it's correlational, so we cannot establish cause and effect. Therefore, we cannot say whether cognitive thoughts cause depression or if depression causes the negative thoughts. Okay, we can't establish cause and effect. It is just correlational. There could actually be something else that's causing the depressive thoughts that we haven't yet considered, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. So we've got a few evaluation points, and I'll separate them into positive and negative in a little bit. So first of all, the cognitive approach is good. I'll just make this bigger, because it gives the client responsibility, and they can take control of their disorder. They have the power to change, so it puts you in the driving seat with regards to this. But a problem with that is if we focus just on the cognitive factors when we're giving someone therapy, we might ignore situational things such as financial problems or bereavement, and sometimes these problems are short term. So financial problems could be something that's short term, and grief is a process that people need to go through, and sometimes we can be quick to diagnose someone with depression and ignore these situational factors instead of supporting them through the situational factors and giving them ways to cope with their situational factors before we start to think about treating the depression. The theory is good because we can apply it to therapies such as cognitive behavioural therapy or CBT, and in the next lesson, in part 2, we're going to look at these treatments. So any evidence that says that the treatments are effective, you can use to support the idea that there is a cognitive explanation for depression. Just like we did with phobias, you can bring that research in to evaluate the explanation. Okay? Good. So, further evaluation. We've got the idea that there might be a different explanation for depression, like I just mentioned. We might be ignoring other factors, so it might not be a cognitive explanation for depression. There could actually be a biological explanation, such as genes or neurotransmitters. So research has suggested that individuals suffering from depression have low levels of serotonin, and this is actually linked to a gene that is 10 times more common in people with depression. Now, you may know that individuals who suffer from depression are often prescribed antidepressants. Often these are SSRIs, and these SSRIs focus on affecting the levels of serotonin. So a biological explanation would suggest that serotonin is actually a better explanation for depression. It could actually be the diathesis stress model, which is a better explanation really than just biological and just cognitive. It could be that an individual has a gene that makes them more susceptible to depression, but this gene also makes individuals more susceptible to having a negative outlook or having faulty thinking. So yeah, there could be a link there between the biological and the cognitive explanations for depression. So just to summarise that, in evaluation, the good things are we've got research support, it gives the client control, and we can develop therapies, and we have evidence to say that therapies are effective, which we'll look at next lesson. The bad things are that the research is just correlational, so we can't establish cause and effect. We can't say that it is the cognitive processes that are causing the depression. It could actually be something else, because it ignores other factors, not just situational factors, but also it ignores biological factors. And these biological factors could be causing depression, such as levels of serotonin. So to finish off, I've got some more exam practice questions. So you've got a 4 marker and a 2 marker. These questions should take you about 7 minutes. So if you want to pause it and have a go at the questions, and then I'll put the mark schemes up. Okay, so the mark schemes for question number 1. So 4 marks, you could use, it says cognitive triad, which is the negative triad. It's the same thing. So the person will have negative thoughts about the self, the world and the future. I'm useless, the world is horrid, I'll never get a job. They may show selective perception of negative, so they might focus on the loss of a job, and they might blame themselves for the loss of a job. So that would be the negative triad if you're explaining it that way. You could explain it using the ABC model. So for this you might say the activating event was losing their job. The belief would be negative, so I'll never get a job, I can't do this, I'm useless, and then the consequence would be a feeling of worthlessness. And then for the next question, so we have here, so strength of the cognitive explanation, it has to be brief, but it has to, you have to elaborate to get you 2 marks. So you could have said that there's research that supports it and then spoken a little bit about that research. You could say that they've provided effective treatments and then spoken a little bit about the treatments. You could say that it puts the client in control. That's something that we discussed that isn't on the mark scheme, but you could use that also. Okay. So, just to finish off, I want you to go back to Classroom and complete the quiz. Again, if you have any questions, comment on the assignment or send me an email.